author, columnist, managing editor of LibertyNation.com, podcast host and conservative policy advocate.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
NATO on the rocks. Justice Sonia Sotomayor running for cover. Joe Biden's inflationary gambits spiral out of control. And do we need to call in Scooby-Doo to solve California's homeless crisis? All this and a whole lot more on today's show. Welcome back to Liberty Nation Radio right here on the Radio America Network, heard coast to coast. I'm your host, Mark Angelides. On today's show, we're going to delve deep into all that ails America. You don't want to miss out. And I'd like to say a special thank you and hello to our listeners out in Park Hill, Missouri on KFOM 1240 AM. Thank you for being here and being part of the team. Remember, this show is proudly sponsored by LibertyNation.com, where you can access podcasts, breaking news, analysis, and a range of biting and brilliant shows to whet your appetite for freedom and your fondness for the great American Constitution. Let's get started. As the eastward expansion of NATO goes into Asia and membership shenanigans are afoot, what challenges is the alliance facing and are the public behind the organization? Well, these are just a couple of the questions I hope our next guest, retired Air Force pilot and former Deputy Undersecretary of Defense Controller, Mr. Dave Patterson, can answer. Thanks for being here, Dave.
Thank you, Mark. Happy to be with you.
So, Dave, I'm hearing reports that NATO is looking to expand membership to countries in Asia. Now, isn't this essentially just trying to surround Russia?
Well, you would think so. I don't think that is going to get much traction. It's been on people's minds for a very long time. You had the Secretary General who visited Asia not long ago, South Korea, I believe, and Japan. And I think that, NATO leadership would certainly like to expand its footprint to, as you say, envelop our adversaries, China, and to a certain extent, Russia on the Far East side. But I doubt that it will get much traction other than just people talking about it.
Okay, because when I was in Iraq, I kept getting offered positions or postings to Afghanistan. And I asked once, why are we so heavily deployed in this area, And the response was basically that, well, Iran is right in the middle and we can close that trap whenever we want. Now, surely Vladimir Putin or whoever comes after him won't take kindly to living in essentially what's a permanent political and military snare. I mean, it didn't bring Iran into the international fold, did it?
No, it did not, and nor will it. We've not been very good, actually, at projecting our forces and projecting our national security interests of late, and I don't think that this idea is going to be particularly useful. I mean, think about it. You're Belgium. And are you going to contribute to a positioning somewhere in the Indo-Pacific? We already have alliances and allies in Japan and Australia, New Zealand. It seems, and we're growing relationships in the island chains, which is been a recent and pretty good idea in my view. But the fact is that it's not likely that Italy is going to get all excited about deploying forces while leaving, their responsibilities in Europe. So it's kind of a hard sell. And I think that the United States would do well to focus on its relationships in the Indo-Pacific as opposed to trying to expand NATO.
It seems to me that NATO is really the vehicle through which many of the nations in the world are attempting, well, almost like a proxy war against Russia, to the detriment of Ukraine, which is the nation taking the full brunt of it. Now, I think most people are agreed that letting Russia walk all over Ukraine is probably a very bad idea, just for a whole host of reasons. But is NATO the right vehicle for such quasi-military actions? Because it doesn't seem to me that it is, because there are countries outside of NATO that are involved in the Ukraine war effort without putting boots on the ground. Uh, and so it seems that it doesn't really seem to me to be the right thing. I think I'm getting a bit lost here, but what's your
I
take
think
on
you're
that?
right. I mean, you're right. I mean, you have to look at NATO and the foundation of NATO and how it was formed, and specifically what it was designed to do originally, and that was to contain the Soviet Union and any sort of mischief they might bring to the Fulda Gap and Eastern Europe. Now you have a totally different dynamic, but nonetheless, the fact that you have the as Secretary Rumsfeld likes to refer to it as New Europe, as a
Mm.
buffer between Russia and its somewhat extravagant designs on the rest of Europe. I think that you know it's got its hands full. You know, I think that to expand its worldview might be, as we know, a bridge too far.
A Bridge Too Far, a fantastic movie with a screenplay written by the amazing William Goldman, I might add. I
Yes.
watched pretty much everything and read everything of his that I can. For those listeners out there who aren't familiar with William Goldman, I recommend it's an absolute treat. Now, let's get back to the US relationship with NATO. At the moment, it seems as though Joe Biden is prioritizing, and this might be the right thing to do because you go where the fires are if you're a fireman, right? But he's prioritizing um, the military capabilities and instructions of NATO over what's happening in the US. And I wonder, is that risking a long-term detriment to the idea of nations as a whole having their own militaries rather than being part of a larger military group?
I think so. I think you hit the as they say, the nail on the head, and you're exactly right. The way the Biden administration seems to think about foreign policy generally, you talked about it with the metaphor of the fireman goes where the fire is. I look at it a little bit differently. I see it as a whack-a-mole approach to foreign policy. We don't think about anything until it becomes a problem. But most recently with Ukraine and Biden's approach to it, I mean, I thought it was terribly inartful to before everything even started to basically tell Ukraine that nothing was going to happen in terms of its membership until the Russian invasion problem was solved. Now that did two things really. It irritated Volodymyr Zelensky, but it also told the Russians that they had a free range to do whatever they want for as long as they want. And they should have gotten that impression
Mm.
anyway when the Biden administration says, we're going to be there as long as it takes. Oh my goodness, that certainly is not comforting for those taxpayers who see their money just going down the Ukraine rat hole.
Yeah, I remember a short time ago, several presidents talking about we've got to end the forever wars. And it
I think
is,
Biden was one of
yeah,
those
he
actually, just
was, yeah.
recently. Yes.
Only after Donald Trump started the Afghan withdrawal. But well, that's a whole other can of worms to go into. But I mean, is it likely that Ukraine's going to become Joe Biden's personal Afghanistan?
It's entirely possible. I think too, you have to look from my perspective. I look at the dynamics of the leadership in NATO, and we see President Biden because he's the face on the milk carton here in the United States. But the fact is that if you want to know who the real, I believe, mover and shaker in NATO is, it's Jens Stoltenberg, the general secretary. I mean, he's the one who people take his calls, and he seems to have a much more adult and thoughtful approach
Mm.
to all of this. he didn't come out first and say any of these things. I mean, he understood what they mean in Europe and how people take those kinds of comments.
Yeah, it's loose lips sink countries, I think is the deal. Dave Patterson, thanks ever so much for joining us.
Hey, thank you, Mark. Happy to be with you.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Does he or doesn't he? Only his tweet writer knows. Does Joe Biden actually look at the economics tweets that he puts out? Well, it seems that with the community notes and the fairly savage ratio that attends each one of his postings, the answer might well be no. We're joined by Andrew Moran, Liberty Nation's economics affairs editor and general all-round fount of knowledge when it comes to economics, is here to tell us whether Joe Biden knows, writes, or even understands the tweets that he puts out regarding the economy. Thanks for coming in, Andrew.
Thank you for having me. And I would add one more thing, though. Liberty Nation's Twitter account fact-checks Biden's tweets regularly, so our audience should also check that.
Well worth clicking on a link to that to follow Liberty Nation's Twitter account. It's full of fun and Seinfeld references for those who appreciate such a highbrow humor. Now, Andrew, so I think we've both been watching this steady stream of infographics and messages from the Joe Biden and the presidential Twitter accounts coming across on social media, where the White House is claiming these huge wins, and then they get fact-checked and community notes, and people just, I mean, there's not a positive response there because it seems that they're all lies. Has Joe Biden become Pinocchio Joe?
Well, what's great about the internet is that everyone has access to all this data and you can just easily fact check what the administration says. So in one tweet, the administration will say, "Oh, look how much inflation has come down." But there are many things to that argument. One is that, well, cumulative inflation has been 15% since Biden became president. Real wage growth only now turned positive after 26 months. The rate of inflation is not falling; it's just rising, albeit at a slower pace. So all this information is just being skewed and misconstrued. And one of the things I love watching is when the administration claims, "Oh, look at all the jobs we're creating," and then it's just a blatant misrepresentation of data. Saying the most popular one is, "Oh, my administration created 13.5 million new jobs." But if you look at Liberty Nation's Twitter account, it fact checks that thing and it says, no, not really, because 13 million of those were returned to the economy. New jobs, maybe at most, the administration oversaw about 3 million. So all these things, I mean, it's frustrating. But I will say the Republicans there too, under Mike Pence, he tweeted something similar after the first few months, and saying, "Oh, we had a record job creation in April, but it was just jobs that were returning to the economy because things were gradually opening up."
Yeah, it seems that the devil is very much in the detail of these things, and there's the old saying, there's lies, damn lies, and statistics, and the administration seems to be going for the trifecta on those
lies,
things.
Damn lies, and Bidenomics.
And Bidenomics. Now, I still maintain to this day that you were the first person to use that in its correct form. So please do check out Andrew's writing on the pages of libertynation.com. Now. The reality is that we live in an age where such messaging it's really almost impossible to get one by the public, because there are so many people. Obviously, there's far fewer people that follow Joe Biden and still follow Donald Trump's Twitter account, for example. But that's still millions of people who are there, and they're waiting for the president or the president's chief Twitter writer or handler, whatever you prefer, whatever term you prefer, to drop some kind of nonsense. And it seems that almost every tweet I'm seeing fact checks or corrections on these things. How do they think they can get away with it? I mean, sure, they're politicians and they figure, yeah, at least this bunch of people are going to vote for me no matter what. I get that. But to even bother putting such things out on the record.
Well, I guess I'm not gonna attest to, let's say, I don't know, gun facts or the political wheelings and dealings in Capitol Hill. But I think when it comes to economics, it's not a very fun subject. People see dollars and cents and adding and subtracting, their eyes roll in the back of their heads. So I think maybe that's what the administration is betting on. But as I said earlier, there's so much access to all this data, and it's very simple too. I mean, if you look at the St. Louis Fred data, which Liberty Nation frequently quotes or cites, it's very simple. It's very chart based and so all that stuff. But overall, I think it's just the subject matter. I mean, Sarah Cowgill, our national correspondent, anytime she talks about economics, she gets bored out of her mind, and
she gets glassy eyed and starts slinging homegrown epithets at people.
So maybe that's the case. Maybe that's what the administration's banking on.
So let's talk about how the economy actually is doing. So you mentioned something that I see a lot of people make a similar judgment when they say, well, inflation's down. You talked about this, and you said why there are many variable factors on how to interpret that, different lenses through which to look at the number that inflation is down. And there were two that there's two that I always consider is number one, sure, it's down now, but is it down from when you started your term? And I think that's probably the most important thing. So, for example, inflation I'm not saying Donald Trump was great for inflation. I mean, a lot of the money that comes due from the things that he put in there, I mean, that's going to add to stuff. But
yes.
I think it was like 1.8% thereabouts. And then now we're celebrating that it's 3%. I mean, I think many of our listeners have read 1984, and chocolate rations are going up from 5 grams to 3 grams next week.
Okay, so there are a couple of points when you talk in your comments here. So first is that in economics you have something called the base effect. I warned about this on your program a few months ago, saying how the high level inflation, when you look at the base effect of that, of course it's going to come down dramatically in the numbers. So let's say June 2022, the inflation was 9.1%. So of course it's going to be the following year's numbers going to be a lot lower than that 9.1%. Second thing too is that also what I wrote on libertynation.com is that there are a lot of renewed price pressures within that CPI report. So you have food inflation still around 6%. You have renewed price growth in beef prices. Electricity costs still up. Gasoline is starting to rise again. So there are many aspects within the CPI that's starting to experience this upward trajectory once again.
Yeah, it seems that it's a very picky measure, as you mentioned in one of your recent articles, that the housing cost was just removed and swiped out of there to make the numbers better. And then, of course, who cares how much linen pants cost when the price of food has gone through the roof? And it's really a question of figuring out which ones are the most important to the everyday American. Andrew Moran, thanks ever so much for joining us. Much appreciated.
Thank you for having me.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
With all the hullabaloo of Joe Manchin visiting the No Labels conference, a lot of people are wondering if there's a threat from a third party to the established two-party system, specifically what most people assume now based on polling, Joe Biden versus Donald Trump in 2024. But we're lucky to be joined once again by Liberty Nation's political columnist, Joe Schaefer, who has a different take on the matter. Thanks for joining us, Joe.
Thank you, Mark.
So, Joe, you don't actually think that third parties, and let's be fair, historically third parties haven't had really any chance of a successful win, but they have worked to chip away leads in certain swing states that have allowed other people to get into power. But your position is that the biggest threat to, for example, a Joe Biden's continued presidency comes from the left.
Yeah, I'm not buying this no labels thing with Joe Manchin. He's in New Hampshire and they're saying, oh, the Biden administration is terrified. I don't think they're terrified. No labels is an establishment organization. They're not rebelling against anything. The idea that Joe Lieberman, the former Connecticut senator,
Democrat senator, I might add,
who supported George W. Bush, is basically a neocon. The idea that he's rebelling against a swamp in the DC establishment is ludicrous. It's an absolute joke. So, Joe Biden has that establishment. They're in the tank for him. He represents them. He is the swamp. The swamp is not the threat to Joe Biden. The real threat to Joe Biden, I wrote an article about this some months ago, is on the left. And so I think an RFK Jr. is much more scarier than him. Not that he would necessarily take the nomination from him, because DNC is going to make sure that doesn't happen, but he's going to sap votes away from him. There are plenty of Americans out there who are Democrats who are just as opposed to the corruption in Washington as Trump supporters are, just in a different way. And I think a lot of these people are fed up with Joe Biden. They don't want to support Joe Biden. And RFK is much more attractive to them than a Joe Manchin or a Joe Lieberman. And that is the real threat to Joe Biden, losing the support of Democrats on the left who do not go along with, basically, it's a uniparty White House. They're very hawkish on foreign policy, which leftists are supposedly against. They're about entrenched politicians, careerist politicians. Leftists don't like that any more than populist leftists don't like that any more than the populist right. So there are so many reasons to oppose Joe Biden on the left, and there's really not any reason to oppose him if you're in the establishment swamp center.
Yeah, I think you might be onto something there, Joe. Specifically, I wanted to kind of ask your take on this segment that you're saying is more a populist left. Now, we saw that in 2016, and they were going for Bernie Sanders, right? And also in 2020, and Bernie Sanders was, well, let's be fair, he was denied the nomination by the party establishment. And now you've got many of those people, I think there's a lot of crossover there, who are supporting RFK Jr. Now, I believe he's around 21% on early polling. It's kind of early to be saying that's where he'll end up on something, but 21% on early polling. But you've also got Cornel West, the author, philosopher, general Renaissance man, and socialist who was an advocate for Bernie Sanders in 16 and 20, a surrogate for him, some might say. So do you think that let's call them the Bernie bros, for lack of a better word, do you think that they are actually going to make the switch or stay at home? Or are they still more driven by the idea of keeping out what they consider the authoritarian right?
I think a Cornel West is too fringe even for the populist left. He'll sap some votes away from Biden, but those are people who probably were looking for an excuse not to support him. Like I said, someone like RFK is much more dangerous because he's got the Kennedy name. He's sort of got the footprint in acceptable camps, even though everything he is saying is unacceptable to the establishment. So that works out two ways for him. Cornel West is just an outlier, and outliers can hurt Joe Biden, but it's not. You're not going to seriously threaten him in any way for the nomination.
Obviously not for the nominations. Cornel West is running. I believe he hasn't secured, but is hoping to run on the Green Party ticket. And we did see some damage done to Hillary Clinton by the Green Party ticket before. And I think there was a morning. I'm just doing this from memory. There was a Morning Consult poll that did a variation, and if there was a third contender, that third contender being Cornel West, they suggested that he might take 6% of the vote in a general election in 7 key swing states. And these are states that Joe Biden basically got by less than 1%, I think, or around 1%. Now, not all of that 6% would be from Democrats, but the majority of it would. And that could really scupper the Electoral College math, couldn't it?
Yeah, anywhere where he loses a demographic bits of support is going to hurt him because his margin for error is so small. He's so vastly unpopular, and so that's where the real fear, if there is in the Biden administration, comes from, is leaking support. So they're going to, hit at Trump. This is basically what they did in 2020. Trump is Satan. Trump is the devil. And they hope that ties them all in together. And there's reason to believe that. Democrats have proven that if you can demonize the Republican opponent, saying this is the most important election ever, they will literally vote for anyone. They proved that in the Pennsylvania Senate race when they supported John Fetterman, who was so seriously plagued by health problems, he really couldn't talk in public. No responsible voter should have supported him. And yet, they're able to whip up their base and make it seem like an existential crisis if you don't support the Democrat. That is what they're going to do with Joe Biden again. I don't think it's going to work because people are so fed up with this administration. People on the populist left said, okay, we backed this guy in 2020. We wanted Bernie, but we went with this guy, and it's been miserable. We're not happy at all. I can't see how anyone on the populist left is ecstatic at the things Joe Biden has accomplished. Sending money to Ukraine, building up NATO. These are not things that drive home with the populist left. So he has a major problem to his left. He does not have a major problem to his center in the Potomac crowd. And so any threat to Joe Biden, whether it be third party or within the Democratic Party itself, is losing voters to his left. And I think it is a major threat to him.
Well, how do you think that'll work out pragmatically? Just in the last 30 seconds, Joe, how do you think that is going to work out as the primary season starts? Because it seems massively unlikely that Joe Biden won't get the nomination. I mean, unless a health issue causes him to step back, in which case the party will almost certainly support Kamala Harris just because she's fun to listen to, and you get great sound bites out of her. Not necessarily in support of her, but great sound bites nonetheless. So how would that work? Do you think there's any chance that RFK gets the nomination?
Well, I'm a big believer in the Gavin Newsom. They would love to push him in there.
President Gavin Newsom in waiting, right?
Absolutely. They realize Kamala is worse than Biden. She's an absolute disaster. She can't run. And I really believe that they understand just how much trouble they're in with Biden here. He's not going to make it. But again, we all thought this in 2020, and look how it worked out. So they were able to push him over the line then. And then they may try and do it again, but I really believe in their heart of hearts they would love to have Gavin Newsom in there instead. But what I would like to stress above all is that the DNC calls these shots. The Democratic National Committee, more than the Republican National Committee, because Trump was able to triumph over them. The Democratic National Committee has done a great job squelching opponents to the candidates that they want to run for president. It used to be what the Republicans did in the good old days of the swamp with McCain and Bush and Romney. The Democrats are still able to do that. And that is the best thing that Joe Biden has going for him right now. And also Gavin Newsom, if they choose to. The DNC is going to select a nominee, let's put it that way.
And we'll see who that turns out to be. Joe Schaefer, thanks ever so much.
Thank you.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas has been feeling the brunt of the full court press of the Fourth Estate due to various apparently moral and legal shenanigans, none of which appear to have risen to the level of criminality or ethical concern. But why are they after him? And what could be in the way to stop this onslaught against the justice? Well, we're lucky to be joined by legal affairs editor, host of the excellent Uprising podcast, Man About Town, Mr. Scott DeCosenza, and birthday boy. I wish you a happy birthday for this particular week, Scott. Scott DeCosenza, thanks for being here.
Right back at you.
We are birth twins, but not
Yes.
obviously with birth.
No.
So, Scott,
Really separate
we've seen Justice Thomas undergo article after article, news segment after news segment, explaining how he's an ethically corrupt
I don't know
person.
what the right word for a conspiracy that is not terribly well organized, but that has a common goal.
Oh, it's a government conspiracy.
No, not government. No, not government.
No, I mean one that's not terribly well organized. Yes,
right.
It's government
Yeah,
conspiracy.
I love that. Excuse me. I appreciate that. No, what I mean to say is there has been obviously an effort to publish on Justice Thomas and really anything negative, from the highest of criticism that they could manage, which is that he had been friends with a billionaire and accepted lavish presents of travel, down to the most preposterous was, I think, that he was a member of an exclusive group, and that group, he allowed them to use the Supreme Court chambers for their ribbon ceremony annually or something like that, and somehow that was inappropriate. No actual inappropriateness that we might see in terms of judging or altering opinions, but just who he consorts with, if you would.
Now, Scott, you wrote a fantastic article this last week on why you think these attacks against Justice Thomas might just stop. They might not be at the forefront of the media push anymore. Would you like to explain to our listeners why that is, if they haven't been wise enough to go and read you on the site, on the pages of libertynation.com?
The attacks against Justice Thomas, I think there's very little there. There's some things that are there. So Justice Thomas, for instance, his rich friend paid for his nephew to attend a private school. Now,
let me just clarify that. That's his great nephew, and to which most people in both your country and mine are what? This is somebody who's your grandfather's brother's son's cousin or something along those lines. Second cousin twice removed. I'm trying to remember my Spaceballs.
In any case, that's less important than the fact that the reason why Mr. Crow paid for the tuition was because of this person's consanguinity with Justice Thomas. And I put that in for any lawyers listening. That means that they're related by blood.
Sure.
And that's why Mr. Crow, basically, the gist of what it sounded like, I wasn't a party to the conversation, sadly. The gist of what it sounded like, Mark, was Thomas indicated that he had this troubles, this kid in his life who he was taking care for. Virginia and Clarence Thomas stepped in to raise the boy from at some point in his life because of his home situation not working out. And he had been at a school for somewhat troubled youth, and he was needing to go to a different school. And Crow is a supporter of this academy and is a graduate there, and he's a billionaire. So I'm guessing he's got a fondness for it. He throws a ton of dough. He's probably on the board. He probably, everything is probably through him there, and he can put somebody in the school if he wants to. And so that's what he did. And I could totally understand how that looks a little bit hinky maybe to some people, but because he doesn't have business before the court, and because Justice Thomas has disclosed his friendship and also has to recuse himself if any business before the court if any of Mr. Harlan's businesses do come before the court, it's not terribly ethically challenging. Juxtapose that with what we know now about Ms. Sotomayor.
Yes,
Ms. Sotomayor,
Supreme Court Justice Sonia Sotomayor. This blew me away when I heard it, Scott. If I do hope our listeners have heard this. If not, let's give them a.
And sorry for not calling her Justice at the outset. Justice Sotomayor is an author. She authored her first book not just quite a year after getting to the Supreme Court. She hadn't authored any books previously. And then she authored a memoir after becoming confirmed to the court, which she got millions of dollars in advance payments for. And since then, she's focused on children's books, and she's written a whole bunch of them and sells quite a few of them to the tune of getting hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars in income. But now we know, Mark, that she uses court staff, taxpayer-funded employees of the Supreme Court to make this book empire work. And the two examples that we have that just seem so totally beyond the pale, Mark, we have her assistant, Ms. Lee, who is a court employee, admonishing municipal libraries who have invited the justice to come and speak at their facilities that they're not buying enough books to have on hand for the attendees. And when they say, well, maybe you should address that with the bookseller or the publisher, this is the librarian saying it to Justice Sotomayor's aide and assistant, she replies, "You don't have enough books." She's not going to bring it up with the publisher. She wants that person. So she's putting the lever, okay? Justice Sotomayor's aide is doing this. And then we learn that in this 11,000 book order, and I didn't put this in the article just there was so much data to kind of digest and decide what to put in and not. Mark, the 11,000 books that Justice Sotomayor had her aide press Supreme Court employees in the service of moving around. Apparently, by the way, she signed all 11,000. So you can imagine what a project that would have been for the court staff to kind of get that all squared away and over how much time. Okay. But the books were sold to the University of Michigan. Of course, taxpayer-funded University of Michigan. So how wonderful for the justice. And my suggestion is that the comparison between these two is so vast and so dire. You know, it's one thing if you're preaching to your kids to eat healthy and you sneak a candy bar in the car in terms of hypocrisy. It's another thing if you're the world's most fire and brimstone preacher and you've got liquor and boys in your car as you're driving down the road. I mean, that's the level, I think, of the gulf here between these two behaviors. And that's why I think this could be a fatal case of hypocrisy for the war on Thomas.
Yeah, it seems that if it were to continue through the pages and the column inches of the Fourth Estate, that it would be their already sullied reputation that would suffer an even greater, perhaps even fatal blow to not cover with such, let's call it what it is. It's a relish that they have for going after Justice Thomas because of his jurisprudence, because of his opinions. And because he doesn't fit their mold. He's a black
man with those opinions. Let's not forget.
Mark, he doesn't fit their mold. And so they've either got to risk stupendous amount of hypocrisy, or they've got to go after Justice Sotomayor for something that is quite clearly to the public. It's not something that requires, forgive me, Scott, it doesn't require lawyers to explain the difference here between the two sets of circumstances. And I think you might be right that we might see an easing off on Justice Thomas because they don't want to go after Justice Sotomayor. Now,
she's no mere ally, by the way. She drives the car over there in terms of the progressive, the progressive wing of the court.
Yeah, it's really, it would be sacrificing the progressive wing, of which she is the lead voice, to go after her as well. Now, I think we both understand that the Fourth Estate in America and Europe is just dishonest enough to say, well, let's not go after Justice Sotomayor, even though it's arguably a very big and important story. Now, did Justice
let me interrupt you if I might, Mark, and just say this. I certainly don't think that people who write these stories are going to be less interested in attacking Clarence Thomas, and the reason why is because I heard you say that he doesn't fit into their ideas of what's acceptable, sort of. But even more than that, his very existence proves them wrong, right? That he is who he is, and so I think they will. But here's what I do think will happen significantly. We know that according to the AP's self-reporting, they spent innumerable hours getting through tens of thousands of documents. They've filed over 100 public record requests. So they've put a ton of resources into this. So while I think we'll see the opinion pieces come out that denigrate Justice Thomas, the splashing of resources that the anti-Thomas groups have spent millions to run commercials and produce and run commercials denigrating Thomas. But when people hear about what he's alleged to have done and then juxtapose that with Sotomayor, that's where I think we're really going to see that movement peter off.
Well, the AP reports they could of course have just borrowed the Supreme Court staff to do their work for them. Scott D. Cosenza, thank you ever so much.
Thank you, Mark.
And that's about all we have time for on this week's edition of Liberty Nation Radio here on the Radio America Network. I'd like to thank our guests, Andrew Moran, Dave Patterson, Joe Schaefer, and Scott D. Cosenza. And of course, extend my thanks to you, the listeners, for tuning in each week. Remember to tune in next week, where we'll be examining all the political shenanigans of the week and the upcoming Supreme Court session. You don't want to miss it. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Don't get caught up in the media madness. Join our movement for free thinking and free speech at libertynation.com. Publishing news and analysis 24/7 with original articles by our team of authors who tell it like it is. Join us each week for online TV shows, The Uprising Podcast, and Liberty Nation Radio. We believe in free thinking and free speech. We are libertynation.com.